Okay, thank you very much, Victor, and I'm very happy to be invited to this super interesting conference. It's a very hot and hot topic right now, and which we must discuss in many different forms. So my presentation will focus on the forest history of northern Sweden, to some extent also northern Scandinavia. And I will talk about the history. I will talk a little bit about reference conditions, and I will also briefly mention ecosystem-based management for the future, or at least my ideas of this topic based on the historical information that I'm working on. And my presentation will be kind of a short overview of the forest history. Short, of course, because it's a huge topic, and I will divide this into a couple of different themes. I will talk a little bit about the pre-industrial boreal forest and how it was used and the forest use intensity then. I will talk a little bit more about the timber frontier movement, the start of the industrial large-scale exploitation of the northern forest in the 19th century. And then I will also talk about the modern forestry, the changes that came in the beginning of the 20th century, how we were kind of trying to restore the forest after the exploitation period. And I will also talk about a few of my, or at least one of my favorite topics right now, the horrible herbicide period in the Swedish forest history in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And then I will move on and talk about the changes of the forest based more on data. The first part will be more of the first three themes will be more of a kind of a historical narrative. And then I will talk more about data on some critical elements in the boreal forest. And then finally, I will end by giving some of my thoughts of how you can or cannot use forest history for the discussions of today's forestry. All what I said, as I said, this will be a very condensed historical narrative, but all that I say will be based on publications. I have noted some of these publications in the slides, but anyone interested, would be happy to share more of the publications or the references for what I'm talking about. Okay, so if we go back about 200 years in the boreal area in Sweden, Finland, and Norway, the forests were, of course, used by people, and there were people here, but it's extremely important to note that we had a very low human population density in these areas, and we have had a huge forest. So the impact by people existed, but it was limited. And the main use of the forest was actually firewood. If you go far back in time, firewood is something that's been used on a much larger extent than any other kind of commodity from the forest. Another thing which happened was that we had lots of grazing in the forest. We had grazing by cattle, cows, horses, sheep, goats, etc. And connected to that, we had burning of forest. It was a good way of promoting the forest as a grazing ground by burning forest. We had some low, and of course, I will come back to that soon. We had a very, most of the boreal forest was actually used by Sami people and either for hunting and fishing or for reindeer grazing. In the picture on the right here, you see huge stacks of firewood also next to the Sami huts. And that was extremely important. In order to survive in the boreal forest, you need to have fuel. That's an absolute prerequisite. We also had some pine tar, potash production, charcoal in some limited areas, but this was a very minor component of the forest use before the 1800s, and it was just in some local areas and not something that was extending over a major part of the boreal forest. We also have to remember that the technology was low. We had access for cutting trees, and fire was perhaps the most potent tool for changing or using the forest. Another thing that we must remember is also that the interior parts of the northern forest in Sweden and in Finland and in Norway and in northern Russia was under Sami control up until the end of the 18th century, up until the beginning of the 1800s. These areas were Sami districts, and Sami districts were divided into Sami community villages, and the Sami community villages were divided into Sami taxation lands, as you see on the map on the right side here. And this was a huge area where the Samis were paying taxes to the Swedish, in this case the Swedish government, to the Swedish king, for the right and to have control over these lands. So these were Sami territories, and that had been ongoing for a very, very long time, far back in time. But at least we know that from the 1400s, 1500s, these taxes were paid regularly, and it was the Sami control was also favorable for the Swedish government, because they kind of used the land and controlled the land, and we had those possibilities to limit the influence from other countries around. And this was the major part of the boreal forest that was under Sami control until the beginning of the 1800s. So very briefly, and just by showing some pictures, what was the forest like then? And I will come back to this and talk about some data later on. Well, we can say that from the studies that we have done, different studies on historical records, and also studies on by using pollen analysis in many different locations, that we had much more open forests than we are used to today. So forests were sparser, but of course with much larger trees and much older trees. It was very common in the interior of Sweden, of the northern part of Sweden, that we had a number of very, very old trees which could exceed ages up to 500 or 600 years of age, and which survived the recurring forest fires. And under that layer, we had a multi-storied forest, and that depended a little bit on time since last fire. We also had lots of dead wood in the forest, dead wood on the ground, dead standing trees. Trees always died in forest fires, but as I'm sure other people will say later on during the conference here, these fires were for the most part ground fires, and they were not high intensity fires. They killed some trees, causing a steady production of dead trees in the forest, but they didn't wipe out whole stands of forest for the most part. That happened, but that was not the rule. That was the exception. But lots of dead trees, many very old and very large trees all over the landscape, not just in spots, all over the landscape. Yes, and of course we had fire, regular fire. I will not go into that. I'm sure that other people will talk more about that. But we had fire was a very strong force in the pre-industrial forest, and it was also a mix of people using fire and the natural fire. We also have to remember that. So I will move on now to the next phase here and talk about the first industrial exploitation of the forest. And I like the concept of timber frontier because that explains the kind of the force and the momentum of this large-scale exploitation that came in the 19th century. This did not only happen here in northern Sweden and northern Finland, it happened in North America also, both on the east coast and on the west coast. It happened in northern Russia a little bit later than it happened here. And we have timber frontier movements also in the tropics at much later dates. But here, and due to the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe, the demand for timber products rose exponentially in the early and mid 1900s. Sorry, 1800s, 19th century. And that caused a timber frontier, a logging frontier, moving up from the coastal areas towards the interior parts of the forest and northwards during the 1800s. And this was an exploitation. It had nothing to do with forestry. It was just a kind of raw exploitation, and it was mainly directed towards the largest and oldest pine trees. Later on, also spruce trees and smaller trees were cut, but in the beginning it was just the oldest and largest trees. And it was going up along the major rivers, and then it went up towards the watershed divides. It did not reach all the way into the westernmost forest, as we can see on this picture. And actually, that's the reason why we have all these big forest reserves today, is that they were not, they were to some extent, but not completely logged. And that's why we have these very unique western forests in northern Sweden today as forest reserves. Everything else then was left. It was just cutting the valuable trees, transporting them to the coast and sawing them up into sawn planks, etc., and exporting them. But wet forest, dead trees, deciduous trees, patches that were difficult to access of less valuable, commercially valuable forest were left. So we got all this, a mix. We got a thin forest from by the oldest trees, but we also had very high value still in the forest, although many of the oldest trees were gone during this period. Yeah, just some pictures from this logging. Actually, most of the pictures are from a little bit later on. We don't have so much pictures from the 1800s. For the trees were cut by axes, of course, transported out of the forest by horses, and then log driving in the rivers down to the coast. Some trees, the most valuable trees, were cut into square cut timber actually, and cut like that in the forest, and then also floated and transported down to the coast. The next phase, the next period that I would like to talk about is the advent of the modern forestry at the beginning of the 1900s. In Sweden, we got a new forest law in 1903, and it was the first modern forest law in Sweden. And this law was passed in the parliament as a reaction to the exploitation of the forest in the 19th century. And it stated that you could not just cut the trees, you must regenerate the forest after logging. And this was the movement into the time of a production-wise sustainable forest. The ideas came from Germany, so all our forest management methods came more or less directly from German scientific forestry, which had been developed since the end of the 1700s. And these were a combination of keeping control over the forest, specific methods to regenerate the forest, specific methods to make trees grow as fast as possible into production trees. And here we started a lot of research and practice connected to seeding of forest, planting of seedlings. We also experimented a lot with prescribed burning in the beginning of the 1900s and also particularly in the mid 1900s. A huge thing was ditching of wet forest. There were many ideas of transforming wet forest into productive forest. Also ditching on clear cuts came later because many clear cuts were flooded after big clear cuts. And of course, the clear cutting method came into use. That had been tried a little bit in the end of the 1800s, but we had lots of experiments on clear cutting in the beginning of the 1900s, from 1910 to 1930. Then that ceased completely due to the Depression and to a big ideological war between different foresters in the 1930s, where the clear cutters lost, and then it came back again in the 1950s. And then from then on, it's been the major method that's been used for regenerating forests in Sweden. Then we also had herbicides and an explosion of using herbicides and pesticides in forestry after the Second World War. And then, of course, we had the mechanization. We started to get people out of the forest and machines into the forest instead to minimize cost and make the production higher in cutting and so on in the forest and transport in the forest. Yeah, just some pictures of this. I will talk a little bit about the most crazy period in Swedish forestry, and we have done a recent study on that. And that period is the herbicide period, when herbicides were used on to a very large extent in the Swedish forest. These herbicides, the phenoxy acids, were developed during the Second World War in labs in the UK and in the United States, and they were developed in order to be used in the war to wipe out the potato production in Germany, spraying the potato fields and causing famine in Germany, and also spraying rice fields in Japan for the same purpose. Neither of these things worked, but after the war, it was realized that these phenoxy acids were very potent to be used in agriculture and also in forestry. So very early on, the Swedish foresters started to experiment with these. They're called hormoslyr in Sweden and Agent Orange in the US, especially when it was used in the Vietnam War also. And our data show that more than 1 million hectares of forest land was sprayed in northern Sweden, which caused an enormous loss of deciduous forest, a loss that we still see today, and of course a loss of the connected biodiversity. Herbicides were sprayed in by different methods, by airplanes, by helicopter, manually, and by different trucks systems here. And the airplane spraying was the most important one, and most of the spraying took place later on in the 60s was done by airplanes. There are many still existing airfields up in the north which were built entirely for spraying forest with herbicides. And this is what it looks like after a herbicide spraying in Malgomaj in Västerbotten. Huge areas of completely dead forest. It was sprayed on clear cuts, but also, as in this case, on older forest in order to get rid of the birch, which was seen as a big problem for the forest. The forest industry just wanted to have coniferous trees and not any birches or deciduous trees at all. But this caused something, this very brutal form of forestry caused enormous protests in Sweden also, and protests that were not happening in Stockholm or Gothenburg or in any of the larger cities. It started in small villages nearby where the herbicides were sprayed, and people were very concerned about health effects and about effects on their where they could pick berries, for example. So there were demonstrations. There were people were sitting on the areas that were supposed to be sprayed and protested, and a number of leading personalities in Sweden, for example, Sara Lidman, a very famous author in Sweden, protested against this also, and had a very important role in stopping this. And actually, just within a few years in the 1980s, the whole herbicide spraying was stopped. And this was also the birth of the environmental movement in Sweden when it came to forestry, because people realized that they could actually protest. So this led also to protest against the large clear cuts and so on. In order to counteract this, some people started try to show that this herbicide was completely harmless. This is the chief executive officer of the BT Kemi, a chemical company producing this product, and he on live on television was drinking the herbicide to prove that it was absolutely harmless. And many foresters did that also as to prove that this was something that you didn't need to worry about. But this only reinforced the protest and caused a really strong reaction from people in terms of the new modern forestry and its consequences on the landscape and consequences on for health and so on. So these were very problematic years in Swedish forest history. Herbicides and insecticides were used broadly and indiscriminately. We had huge, large, completely open clear cuts, and we can't even imagine the size of these clear cuts today. People who have been around for a longer time, like me, can maybe remember that when we were out looking at these landscape covering clear cuts that we actually don't see today. Heavy machinery disturbing the soil and being very bad for wetlands and so on were used. And many very unique old forests were logged during this period also, but still many were remaining at the end of the forest at the period. Sorry. So this was a little bit of a sad story, but I also want to bring in one I consider a good guy and an early eco-forester, and that's Joel Ephraim Wretlind. He was a very charismatic person and a very charismatic forester in the Malå district in northern Sweden in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. He had an idea of how to use fire as a forest regeneration method. And he practiced that despite many conflicts with his superiors in the state forest. He wanted to burn forest under seed trees. He wanted also to, so that was his method of regenerating forest. He was also a strong promoter of deciduous trees. In the middle of this crazy period with herbicides, he was very considerate when it came to deciduous trees. And he was also had a very good dialogue with the Sami community in this area that he was working. So he developed method that I would like to see again, actually, and very early on. He's been a little bit forgotten in time, but he developed method that I think should be valuable to bring back again. Regarding deciduous trees, he said something that I really like to quote here, and that was, and remember that this was in the very middle of the herbicide period, also when all the forest districts around him was where they were spraying herbicides. And he said, those who advocate the use of herbicides to kill birches should drink the poison themselves. But his method was to develop these specific burning practices under seed trees in order to get good regeneration. And he did not advocate, he said also that you should cut away the seed trees afterwards, but at least you mimicked a very good way of natural regeneration in this type of boreal forest, in the pine-dominated boreal forest. We can skip this. I'm running a little bit short of time here. This is just showing a diagram showing the different epochs of this modern forest period. I would like to end by talking a little bit about the changes in the boreal forest from during the last 150 years. First of all, and this is something which comes up regularly, is that by politicians and foresters, that they say that we have never had so much forest or timber in the forest as we have today. This is not true. We had much more timber and volume in the timber volume in the forest in pre-industrial time, before the timber from frontier came to Sweden, to northern Sweden, and then we reduced the amount of wood and timber in the forest during a 50-year period, and then it started to be built up again. So that is important to remember, that we had different forests, but very rich in volume in the 1800s. Of course, we had large numbers of large trees also in these old growth forests in the 1800s. These diagrams are from two different locations, one on the left and one on the right, and you can see the upper diagram on both sides is the situation in the late 1800s, with the numbers of very large trees up to almost 6 centimeters in diameter at breast height, and below you see the same numbers when we finished this study in the 1990s. And then we can also take a look at the reduction of dead trees. Dead trees were extremely common in the forest before, in pre-industrial times, and as I said, due to the forest fires killing some trees in the forest, but leaving most trees. And these trees were cut for firewood, for constructions in a river, for log driving, etc., and also for sanitation reasons. They were thought of being spreading pests and so on in the forest. Age of the forest reduction, the age of the forest has of course been severely lowered during this period of from the time of the early logging until today, and also the amount of multi-storied forest. This we have shown in many different studies, but we are losing the multi-storied forest. That was the natural forest type in pre-industrial times, and now we have very little multi-storied forest. So I want to finish also a little bit about talking a little bit about how to use, or can we use, history at all in today's discussions about modern forest and about eco-forestry. Well, I start by quoting Winston Churchill: "Those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it." I really like this quote. Actually, he stole it from a Spanish philosopher, so it's not his quote in the first place, but he's most known for saying this. Is history or historical state of the forest, is that a template that we should use in the future? Well, probably not. But how can we then use historical information? Maybe we can use, by understanding history, we might be able to avoid making the same mistakes again. That I think could be quite important. But maybe we can also evaluate current methods against how the forest has been before, and also how the forest has developed over time. But we must always remember that forests are dynamic. They are also related to people, to the society. So it's not, I don't think it's a very good idea to create a museum of past forests, but we need to understand the history in order to be able to move on with a good eco-forestry for the future. Something that I would like to stress from, and also based on this lecture, is that we can see what did not characterize the pre-industrial boreal forest, and clear cutting is something very modern. We have not, there has been no clear cutting since the last ice age and until the beginning of the 1900s. And Victor said, quoted Timo Kulovainen regarding the connection between clear cutting and forest fires. And I just want to reinforce that clear cutting and forest fires have nothing to do with each other. It's not anything that's clear cutting is not a model based on how forest fire acts in the ecosystem. That's absolutely untrue. This comes up again and again. We did not have monocultures. We did not have single species stands in the past. That's something that has not been the case in the boreal forest. We did not have even age stands. Even after stand replacing fires, we do not get even age stands. And that's very important to remember. This intensive soil scarification scares me a lot, because this is something that's not only problematic from a soil from the soil view, it's also problematic from a cultural history view, especially when you're doing it in Sami areas which have been used by Sami people in the past. We are destroying the record of their land use. Chemicals, of course, not. What we did have were much more open forest with larger trees. We had deciduous components in all forests, also in dry Scots pine forest. We had at least a few very old trees per hectare in most forests. In some cases, many very old trees, but at least always a few very old trees. We had age and species heterogeneity at different scales. And of course, fire was a very important component, fire and fire influence at different temporal scales in different types of forests. Now we're discussing clear cutting versus continuous cover forestry, and this is an extremely important topic to discuss. I'm a little bit worried about continuous cover forestry from the standpoint that we don't really have methods to do good nature consideration with continuous cover forestry. Or maybe I will learn after this conference that we do have that. But when I see this discussion, I feel a little bit uneasy, because just by moving into continuous cover forestry doesn't mean that it's good from nature consideration view. We must develop methods, just as we have with a clear cutting method, that promotes really good nature consideration also in continuous cover forestry. It also scares me a little bit that we will go in with machinery very regularly in the same stands very often to cut trees. But again, this is out of my knowledge, and I hope to be more informed after this conference. Thank you. Sorry, I can skip that. Thank you very much, and please ask questions or come with criticism or comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lars, for a really inspiring lecture. We have a few questions from the attendees. So the first question that I want to read for you is like this. How I'm curious about how common Salix, so goat willow, was in the early 1900s and 1950s compared to today, because I contacted the forest statistics at the SLU, and I got the answer that there are now about 16.8 million cubic meters, and in 1926 there were around 4.14 million cubic meters of goat willow in Sweden. This sounds very unlikely to me. Or can it be true that there were less goat willow historically? What's your take on this?
Well, I think first of all that the statistics are okay. I'm not absolutely sure about the details of these statistics. In some cases, it's not everything that was counted in the early surveys, but I think the statistics are okay. Probably we had much more goat willow earlier. I mean, it's difficult to have statistics from a specific period of time and have nothing before that time. Then you tend to, I mean, you only get back to that time, and then you think that's okay. It was we had very few salix or goat willows in the 1800s also, but that might not at all be true. So I don't doubt the statistics, and it's probably correct that we had less goat willow both in the 50s and in the 1920s. But what it looked like before and what quality these goat willows had before, that is another question. Maybe we have a lots of much younger goat willows now. I see them, lots of them along the many forest roads that we have today, and they are not of any real ecological quality yet. They will be of high ecological quality, but they are not yet. So probably, so that's another issue with this. I also know that, and we have interviewed a lot of people who were doing the spraying with herbicides in the 1960s and 70s, and they said that some of them were really sad when they were ordered to spray super old goat willows, really old rowans, sorbus also. So we lost a lot of maybe the most important trees in that time, and we have replaced them with less ecologically valuable trees. They will be valuable in time, but as everyone knows, a goat willow that's 200 or 300 years old has a fantastic biodiversity, but a young tree or many young trees which are just 50 years old are not that valuable, even though they compensate in volume. Something that happened during both world wars, the First World War and the Second World War, was that there were huge amounts of less commercially valuable trees cut as to be used as fuel in the major cities and the entire country. And that meant that there was special cuttings of, for example, birch trees, but also other deciduous trees that were not used by industry. And the first national forest inventory, it came just after the First World War, and the second national forest inventory came just after the Second World War. And that these facts that we had cut so much, and people had been cutting all these trees for charcoal production and for fuel production, and that they targeted these less valuable trees, the salix, the birch, the aspens, and so on, to a large extent. That probably influenced the amounts we had just at that moment, or these two moments. So probably if we have had a national forest inventory data from 1910, we would have had much more deciduous trees and all the deciduous trees, but they were gone at the time of the First World War and the Second World War. So that is one explanation, maybe not a complete explanation, but that is one explanation why we have low amounts at that time.
Okay, thank you for that. Then it's another question here. Would Sweden's historical forestry practice be considered ecocide under the definition that is currently being proposed?
I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer that question, but I think you understood from the presentation that apart from the Eco-Forestry, you will Efraim Wretlind, the period from 1950 until 1990, perhaps. To me, this is a very, very bad period in Swedish forestry. It's a very problematic period. Of course, you can add on top of that the current logging of the very last remnants of natural forest also, which is, I mean, other things are better now, but this is also a very big problem now. So I can't answer that, but I think this is a very problematic, and this caused a depth also for Swedish forestry that they have to pay back. They have to do much better because they did such bad in this period, and they caused so many ecosystem problems that will take generations to solve, actually. But I will not go into the definition of ecocide. I can't do that. I don't know. But at least it was super bad then.
Yeah, thanks. There's another question, a historical question. What about the clear cutting around the mining areas before the 1900s?
Yes, they were cutting a lot of trees, but and that's a little bit. It's on the border of the Boreal zone, actually, so that's why I didn't really include that. There is also an idea that huge areas were clear cut around the mines in the Bergslagen region in Sweden, and that's actually not true. There was sustainable forestry there, and it's been shown in studies that yes, there was a lot of thinning of forest, and there was not so much clear cutting actually, and it was fairly sustainable forests. And that was important that it was sustainable. You couldn't just clear cut a huge area and then don't have any wood for charcoal and for other wood you needed to the mines and to the ironworks. Yes, high pressure on the forest around in the mining areas in the southernmost part of the Boreal forest, but no enormous clear cuts or complete loss of forest. There is very interesting because in some of these areas, after the mining and the ironworks stopped, then they established sawmills in the same place, and that says something about the state of the forest. I mean, you don't establish a sawmill if you don't have trees.
Right. Yeah,
it's a very good report on that.
Yeah, thank you. A last question. Lars, can you elaborate your statement, we should not create a museum of the forests?
I think that there are, and this is what this conference is about, I mean, there are fantastic ways of developing sustainable forests, and I believe that we should have a ecologically sustainable forestry in Sweden. I honestly believe that we should also have large areas, much larger areas with protected forest. That's really important. But so these two things should go side by side or hand in hand. But I think I see a way forward of using the production forest and the forest which has been logged before and which has maybe poor properties today. We can develop such forest into much more interesting things than we have, and I see that. Maybe I was referring to the fact that we can't just go back and kind of do make forest as they looked before. I mean, forests are also a part of society, and I honestly believe that we should be using the forest, but in a much better way. The forest that is to be included in the the forest that should be used, and not the forest that should be protected. Maybe the forest that should be protected, they can be seen as museums, because you not only have a natural museum there, you also have a museum of historical forest use in these forests. All the big reserves have such qualities also. You see ancient practices, you see traces of ancient use, Sami land use, for example, in the big reserves, and that's really interesting. So they could be seen as museums.
Thank you. Thanks.